Okay, we can do it this way. Yeah. Hello. Welcome. We're just going to jump right into it. It's spring office hours. Normally, we like to talk about the calendar and what's coming out. This week, there's nothing being released. It's a holiday week. It's a short week. Last week, we had some really cool releases, and that's why we're here. That's why today's show is happening. We had a release of Spring Authorization Server, and Steve from this Spring team focused on Spring security is here to talk about the release notes. We thought, hey, this would be a great practice. Everybody should be reading the release notes. I know not everybody does, but I've been burned by that, and I'd like to, help our community understand what's going on. Maybe they don't have time, but maybe we can give them a little bit of tips and tricks, give them the executive summary on what's going on. So we're gonna try it out.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this before, DaShaun, but just reading the release notes is not always enough. Like sometimes it may be a new feature and you're not quite sure like what that feature is trying to do. So it's a good time to just have a discussion about it and why that feature or upgrade might be important to you.
That's it. So, Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
You're our first guest.
Here.
Oh, yeah, you are the first guest.
First guest. Wow. Hey, making history.
That's it. And yeah, we're gonna do so much more. And yeah, we're just getting started. But thank you for being our first guest. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Steve Riesenberg. I joined the Spring team about a year ago, last May. I've been doing a lot of financial technology, online banking, building platforms for mobile. And in that time, I was using Spring Security heavily, and so became very, very interested in it. And so I kind of found an open rec for a new member of the Spring Security team, and applied for that and got in with them. And so far they haven't kicked me out yet, and so I've been enjoying that. And coming into it, I hadn't had a ton of exposure to OAuth, just kind of the normal exposure that we all have as we're moving in and out of various projects that involve OAuth. But I got asked to kind of work and focus specifically on the Spring Security OAuth support and Spring Authorization Server with Joe Granja. And so been doing a lot with Spring Authorization Server, ramping up, doing community support, adding some features. And then lately, as we'll talk about, adding some reference documentation and a number of other really cool things. So it's been a real good time so far, and I'm hoping for another great year starting now. So
yes. And Steve's right up the street, just right up by 29, a couple 2-3 hours. So we got to hang out a couple weeks ago.
that's right.
For those of us that might not know, what is Spring Authorization Server? It sounds cool, but what is it?
Well, Spring Authorization Server is a framework, not necessarily a product in and of itself, but a framework. It's built on top of Spring Security, and it provides support for OpenID Connect 1.0 and OAuth 2.1 specifically. So you can build potentially OpenID certified products with it as an OpenID provider, or you can build just regular OAuth 2 authorization servers that can be kind of the central authentication system for your OAuth-based architectures. Or you could build products out using either OAuth 2 or OpenID. So those things are all on the table with this framework. So
Excellent. Well, how about we jump in? Dan, do you have anything?
So I think so for those who may not be familiar with OAuth, I know OAuth can get very complicated, but just generically speaking, what do you think of when you hear the term OAuth?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of different things that people might emote when they're thinking of that. Some of it might just be, holy cow, that's really complicated. That's actually the first thing I might think of. But that's really why Spring Authorization Server is so powerful, because it kind of is designed to help you remove a lot of the complexity at a framework level for supporting OAuth. But What it is allows you to centralize your authentication. And so you might think of it as a solution for federating authentication across an enterprise, for example. So if we have a lot of properties, a lot of websites, a lot of access that we need to enable for various departments in our organization or something like that, and we want to centralize how they log in and manage that in one place, we can stand up an authorization server to do that. And that authorization server can be very loosely coupled with all of those other properties, but we can control their authorization concerns in one place. So info security groups love it, for example, and developers, once they get over that initial learning curve, love it as well, because we can reuse all of the stuff that we've built and thought about how to build authentication into our products, authorization into our offerings. And so that's really at a high level what it's designed for. And then there's the kind of more traditional ways of thinking about it. If you take like an online course that kind of goes through the essentials of OAuth, it might describe, well, let's say you want to log into, like say Google or Yahoo, and you want to access a bookmarks feature for some other third-party site. You don't want to give your Yahoo or Google or Amazon or whatever password to that third-party site. How do you enable that? And so OAuth kind of steps in to allow you to have this standardized model of communicating back and forth between those two sites as a trusted relationship. And you, as the resource owner, as the specification calls it, says, I will authorize third-party site to access my profile at, say, Yahoo or someplace like that. So that's kind of the more traditional answer. Yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, how about we do this? I just posted the link to the blog announcing a release. How about I turn it over to you, Steve, and just tell us, like, if we're new, what should we be looking at? If we're upgrading from the previous version, what's changing? I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Sounds good. So shall I share my screen here? We can kind of,
yeah.
What we have here. I've never done this, so give me a second here. And I can do a specific window, it looks like. Or I can do the whole screen. Let's do the whole screen. Nope, let's not do the whole screen because I have to give it permissions, which I haven't done yet. Okay. All right, can you guys see my browser window there? Okay, so this is just our typical release notes section here. We can just kind of go through some of the things that we've worked on. But the biggest thing that I want to point out is that we've added reference documentation. So before we go into any of the other things, one of the biggest announcements is that we've added reference documentation. And so if you kind of click through to this issue, Joe helped us put out a very robust outline of the reference documentation that we'd like to go through and build out for this first release. And from there, we're going to be adding a lot more. Say again?
Can you bump up your font a couple?
Yes, I would be happy to.
And I will add that. Thank you.
How's that? Okay. And I'll do that as we click through here as well. So this was kind of our initial starting point. We'd like to add an overview, getting help, getting started, just the typical sections that we'd like to have. And this is obviously information that's been missing from Spring Authorization Server for a while. We didn't have this documentation built out. So when people would come to the project and find it through GitHub or through spring.io with the announcement that the old Spring Security OAuth support had been deprecated and was being end of lifed, they would come here and say, how do I get started? How do I learn what's going on? And so we obviously wanted those basic sections to kind of introduce people to Spring Authorization Server, how to get started. And then from there, we had kind of a goal to build out a basic set of touch points for how to understand configuration, the core components of the framework itself. And again, these are things that are on top of Spring Security or in addition to Spring Security. So we're not reinventing the wheel and saying, how do you use Spring Security itself, but how do you use specifically Spring Authorization Server and what are its components? And then as we just talked about with OAuth, it's a complicated topic. And so there was a number of endpoints that we've built out that have been built out for authorization server that just come out of the box. And so what are those endpoints? How do they work? What are the specifications that they're related to? So if you're more technical minded and want to get into the weeds, you can click through and do that. And so we wanted to build out this protocol endpoints section. And then the last thing that I'm really excited about that we really had as an initial target that we would continue to add to as time went on was a set of how-to guides. And this is where we wanted to focus on getting stuff done with Spring Authorization Server. So how do you fill in the blank? And so we went on Twitter and we asked some folks, hey, can you jump on to our project and either upvote or provide new recommendations for how-to guides that you could benefit from as a member of our community that would show you how to do useful stuff with this framework, with this open source project. And so we got a number of contributions for ideas. And so some of those, as you scroll down on this issue, this is issue 499 in Spring Authorization Server, you can see that people were just adding lots and lots of stuff out here. So if I kind of expand this, there's lots of good requests for new things. We got some good comments on this. And then we also asked people to upvote their favorites. And so which of these guides would be most relevant to you? So I'm scrolling fast here, but if I just pick on one here, for example, let's say how to customize form-based login. If I click on this guide, we can see that 9 people have upvoted this. And so this is a fairly popular issue. And so that tells us relatively how many people are interested in it and when we might be able to fit that into our release cycle for adding that as reference documentation, as a how-to guide, I should say. So that's just kind of gives you some background for what we were planning as we went into this. And let me just...
I'll just say something while you're heading over there. I love these how-to guides because the reference documentation, you know, it can get pretty in the weeds and tell you a lot about the product, but there's also like missing, you know, DaShaun and I talk about the why a lot. Like, why do I need this? What are, like you said, some things that I could do with this? What are the, you know, most common things that I might use this for? So being able to walk someone down that path is really great. And I love I love the guides across our products. So I'm excited to see those there.
Yeah, it feels like, you know, the kind of the right model. And so that was, let me just find that blog post so we can have that ready. I apologize, didn't get that ready, but that, you know, it just gives you that grounding of like, you know, most people come to a site like spring.io or, you know, they start a Google search with something like Spring Authorization Server, and their first question is, how do I get started? But their second question is, how do I do useful things? And so I think that's exciting to see that that's going to be a focus for us. And I hope that the community feels good about that. But here's that blog post that DaShaun, you mentioned. And again, if you go to this blog post on spring.io, Spring Authorization Server 030 available now, which we did link on Twitter if you have that and want to retweet that. This has links to all the stuff that you need to get started with this release and our reference documentation. So you can click on the reference documentation link here in the blog post, and that will take you to this page. And so right now we're building out our documentation as a multi-page site. So you can kind of see the different sections that we've built out here, as I mentioned, from that outline. And so if it's okay, I could just go through just a few of these and just show what this looks like before we keep talking about the release notes. Are you guys cool with that?
Yes, that would be wonderful.
All right. Just to kind of give people a preview of what this looks like. So, you know, your first question was, what is Spring Authorization Server? And so actually that's a good model that Joe and I talked about as kind of the way that we would even build out this documentation is just starting with questions. What are the questions I have if I think of myself as an end user of this framework? And so right here we have kind of that introduction section. It's just a paragraph, pretty simple. But again, it kind of captures the essence of the answer to that question. Is it's a framework that provides implementations for OAuth 2.1 and OpenID Connect 1.0. And again, we link to the specifications here. So if you're interested in that, you can just click through and go, hey, what's OAuth 2.1? I've heard of OAuth 2.0. I didn't know there was a 2.1. Here you go. You can read the specification. You don't have to do that if that's not for you, but you can do that. And then we mentioned that it's built on top of Spring Security. And so some folks that are coming to this might not know anything about Spring Security. So again, we've provided a link right to the project page for Spring Security. So you can click through and you can find out more about Spring Security itself, which is kind of the core authentication and authorization framework for the Spring ecosystem. And it's what Spring Authorization Server is absolutely built on. So you can get more about that. Here's links to all the reference documentation for Spring Security. You can see how many versions that we're currently supporting. There's quite a few, and kind of go from there. From there, we added a feature list, and this is useful for folks that are like, what does Spring Authorization Server do? What does it do? I have no idea where to start. And so you can kind of see at a high level some of those features organized. And then you can click through here. You can almost look at this as a roadmap for the rest of the documentation, because if you're interested in a particular feature, you can come here and say, well, I want to know about just the authorization grants that are supported. And so I can click in on here and see, it links me right to the token endpoint that's relevant for that topic. And it talks about those grant types and what you can do with this endpoint and how to configure it. But from there, you can kind of link to specific things like user consent, and this will talk about the authorization endpoint. And again, I'll go through this at a more organized high level in a second, but just showing you how you can kind of navigate through the documentation from this feature list. And then if, again, you're interested in specific topics for the specifications, we've kind of outlined those things in the specifications that we're implementing under this category of feature. So the authorization code grant, the client credentials grant, the refresh token grant. What are those things and how do they work? You can click through to that. And so you can kind of see how we've gone through and outlined each of these high-level features. And Joe did a great job on kind of reorganizing this feature page for this release. And so I thought that this is a very helpful place to get started if you just want to know what in the world is this thing, and maybe what are some specific topics that you want to learn about.
So yeah, from the blog post, the documentation, the work that was put into the documentation, that was a big part of this release, right? So yeah,
huge.
Excellent.
So we spent, I would say, most of the time on this, and there'll be some other things we'll talk about. So maybe percentage allocations. It's not exactly 90%, but it was a big push. And so while the documentation itself isn't particularly something that you can use when you download the jar into your project, but now you have a place to go to actually learn about what that jar file from Maven Central does for you. And so I think that it's worth calling out that this is a huge part of our release.
Yeah, just for me, the difference for me, just as I'm building out demos, I noticed that I was going to the documentation more than I was going to the other examples or the samples that were released out on GitHub. So it's already been a big benefit for me.
Oh, that's good to hear. That is really good to hear. Yeah, and I think that with any luck, we'll continue to get that feedback. So good. So that's kind of the overview, and getting help, pretty basic. But again, for community members that maybe aren't super oriented, don't know their way around the ecosystem and the different places where we do things like ask questions, report issues, this is obviously a page that will help you with that. And so Stack Overflow is linked here, and we're just using the Spring Security tag because Joe and I are really part of the Spring Security team. We're not a separate team. And so you can ask Spring Authorization Server specific questions by just using the Spring Security tag on Stack Overflow. So that's kind of worth knowing and calling out there. From that, getting started is probably, I hope, going to be the most popular page in this documentation, because The next question you might have, if you're pretty sure you want to use this or even just try out Spring Authorization Server, the question would be, how do I get started? And so we've kind of put together a basic outline of that getting started experience for you. And this is going to continue to evolve. As we, for example, add Spring Boot integrations, we would be able to simplify this getting started experience. But right now, the getting started experience is pretty much you add Spring Authorization Server to your class path, and then you have to do all of the things to configure it either yourself, or as you can see in the documentation here, there's a few shortcuts we've provided, but nothing close to a Spring Boot starter or auto configuration. And so that's something that we'll look to add in the future to improve this experience. But for now, you just start where this documentation starts. We're going to add Spring Authorization Server to our class path, to our dependencies, either Maven or Gradle. And if you want to learn more about that, you might be curious to go over to Spring Boot's documentation for that. We're not going to repeat a lot of the details here for how to use Maven or Gradle with, for example, a Spring Boot project. But from there, you'd come down and you'd say, okay, what's the minimal configuration that I need to get started? And so this kind of walks you through that. And so if you're interested in shortcutting that, you can obviously just jump straight to our default sample. So if I click through here, that might be a good shortcut for you. If you're interested, you can just jump here, and this is the default sample within our samples directory, which is in our main repository. So if you're looking for the samples, they're in the main repository. And you could just grab this and go, and you could run an authorization server without any setup. But if you're like me and you want to actually play with it in a standalone project, what follows here is that kind of minimal configuration. And it's minimal in the sense that if you want a fully customizable Spring Authorization Server, this is the minimum number of components you have to provide. It's not necessarily the minimum lines of code that you could use to get started. And so other places in the documentation will show you how like the minimal out of the box number of lines of code might be possible. But this getting started snippet here or sample will give you a really good place to start and allow you to begin customizing it right away. And so, for example, we've called out here, and there's some call outs in the code here that you can read the descriptions of, but we've added 2 filter chains. And so these filter chains are necessary to separate the OAuth and OIDC endpoints that I referenced earlier, that we'll talk about more in a minute, from just your normal requests that are coming into your Spring Boot application. And so the default filter chain would be where all of your normal requests go. And this authorization server filter chain is where all of these specific requests to these special endpoints that are provided by Spring Authorization Server would go. And, as we were kind of building this out, we were working with our documentation specialist, Jay, on the Spring team, and he recommended that we add some comments here. So we've added some comments about what in the world's going on in this example to help folks really understand as they look at the sample code what each of these little bits of code is doing. And so in this one, you can see that when you hit the authorization server filter chain and you're not an authenticated user, you're going to need to log in somehow. And so we provided a way for you to get redirected to some kind of login page. And Spring Security, if you're familiar with it, you'd know that we provide an out-of-the-box login page that you can use for getting started. That is then easy to customize for your own application. And so this, by default, will redirect to that login page. And so it's just simply referenced as /login, a pretty easy to remember endpoint. And so you can see that that's exactly what we're doing here. And then obviously the second filter chain kind of goes through the basics of Spring Security. You're going to set up every request to be authenticated. We're going to use form login, again, our out-of-the-box getting started experience for Spring Security for authentication. And then that's it. Pretty simple. And then we've included a default user here for you to kind of get started. And so this would be a little different than if you were to go to start.spring.io and create a Spring Boot application with Spring Security, where you might get a user with the name user and a randomly generated password. We've showed you how to go ahead and specify a static password for your default user. But of course, you wouldn't want to use this configuration in production because user and password are pretty terrible credentials. So just to call out that's an important thing here, but we do have a really easy user to get started and try this out. And then the rest of these bits here are, things that you can kind of read about on your own, but those core components that we'll reference later in the documentation: a registered client repository, a JWK source that will help you with your keys. And then we've included, for getting started, a randomly generated key pair so that you can just immediately use Spring Authorization Server in a secure way, but mostly just for getting started experience. So again, the topic of kind of managing keys is very advanced, and that would be something that, if community members have a lot of questions on, and I imagine many would, we could provide a guide for that. That would be a good candidate for a guide. How do I manage keys? How do I rotate keys? How do I use some kind of key management provider that's external to Spring Authorization Server? But that's not going to be covered here. So we've just had a very simple generated key. And then there's some provider settings. And again, you can read the descriptions down here of what each of these things do. And we've even provided links for you to kind of jump to that relevant section of our documentation. As I mentioned, we're built on top of Spring Security. So there's going to be times in this documentation where we actually link to Spring Security's documentation itself. And so user detail service is a great example of where we're reusing something for our getting started experience from Spring Security. And so if you want to know what is a user detail service, you would click here. And in this case, it'll jump you to the API documentation for that class or that interface. And from there, you can read a little bit about it. So that's kind of a crash course of the getting started. And I just wanted to call that out because I think it's really the place I'd recommend people go if they're interested in learning about Spring Security. And really the main push for this initial release of the documentation so that people have that as a resource. And then I would encourage the audience to go through and click on each of these links and learn more about Spring Authorization Server. We won't have time to go through each of these. But I did want to start with kind of showing you the format for one of our how-to guides as well, because I'm really excited about this. And we only have a couple in this initial release. And as I mentioned, we're asking our community to upvote the topics in the how-to guides that they're most interested in. And that will help us prioritize which one we do next and which one we do as a follow-on and keep building out this list of how-to guides to do useful things. But the two that I worked on personally and that we managed to get into this release are how to customize the user info endpoint, which is an OpenID Connect specific topic. And then another one that was pretty popular and is pretty useful is how to implement our core services. So the Spring Authorization Server core services with JPA. And the reason I think this is a popular and important topic is because persistence is very complicated when you're talking about a framework trying to provide the ability to persist data from, this huge complex topic like OAuth into some database or something. And so we provided some out-of-the-box solutions for persistence, but one of them is in memory, which is not at all persisted, and the other one is a JDBC-based persistence mechanism. But those two leave something to be desired for many of our users. And we've got a lot of comments from them on, how do I do something else here? And so providing an example for JPA with Spring Data was an opportunity for us to say, well, we're not going to support the JPA mechanism out of the box with the framework, but we can show you how to do it. And so you can go on there.
One of the questions I have is, Dan and myself both work with customers, and we've got customers that are using Spring Authorization Server today, and they're using it in unique ways. Maybe they're doing something different. is it possible, would it be valuable for somebody that's using Spring Authorization Server to contribute their own how-to? This is how me, community member A, is connecting to Azure AD, for example, and provide it with Spring Authorization Server. Is that something that is doable? Is that something that's worthwhile? Is that something we should be encouraging? I feel like I should be encouraging our community members to share what they're doing, and submit it as a PR to these how-to guides. Is that possible, and is it advisable?
It's a good question. That's something that, up until now, we've kind of been saying, let's hold off a little bit, just because we, Joe and I, being kind of on Spring Security and focusing on Spring Authorization Server, have been quite busy. And so one thing we were worried about in the early days was like getting a lot of those contributions and not knowing what to do with all of them. And so I'd say that up until now, our answer has been, yeah, let's hold off. But now that we have kind of a basic outline for this documentation, we have an initial release, we know where to put things, I would say now's the time to at least begin thinking about and having a conversation with the core team on contributing stuff like that. And so I mentioned that issue 499 here. I think even though this issue is closed, potentially you could add a comment on here and we'll see it if you went down to the bottom and said, hey, I have this guide that I'd be interested in contributing. Certainly you could also just open an issue, and I would recommend for community members thinking about doing that to start with an issue, not a PR, but open an issue saying, how to, and then this topic. And then you could just say in the description, hey, I prepared this, if that's something you've already prepared, or if you're just thinking about it, that might even be better, saying I'm thinking about providing this, what do you think? And then we can just have a conversation about it. And I think for sure some of those would be things that we'd love to get in, and other things might be stuff that we'd say, let's we'll link to it and keep a conversation going, and then also give the community an opportunity to again upvote those things and say, I want this in the core documentation. And then that would be a clear indicator that not just one person, but many people are interested in it. And then we would definitely look into getting that in. So I would say yes is the short answer.
I just want to touch on something too that you said there. I think that too many times in open source, people get eager to kind of contribute, which is great. But I think, the real value in open source is having that discussion first. So whether it's a documentation PR or a new feature, open up some issue, find some issue that's already open, or start that discussion before you do anything, because you don't know, maybe something else is going on behind the scenes where that thing's already getting created. So, and as authors of this open source library, you might have something to contribute and say, I like the idea of that how-to guide, but maybe you should put this piece in there too, because we've seen a lot of requests for that. So really great point in starting a discussion first before you just kind of fire off a PR.
Yes. And thank you. That is everything that you said there was perfect. It's, that's exactly how we think about it is we love to start the conversation and then help the folks that are interested in contributing go down the path that's best for not just them, but for the whole project. And so we bring a little bit of context that maybe they don't have, and they bring context that we don't have. And so that conversation is just infinitely valuable. Yeah. Cool. So shall I continue? We can kind of keep working here. We've covered the reference documentation as kind of the main thing here. I'm going to go back to our release notes here. And again, this is linked from that blog article. So if you're interested in that, we have the release notes linked from the blog article here. And, there's just a number of things that were in this release. And I guess if I were to put some themes on this, one of the biggest themes that I see in these release notes here is that we were able to upgrade from Spring Security 5.5. And again, because Spring Authorization Server is a separate framework, even though it's built on Spring Security, just like anything else, it has to declare a dependency on Spring Security and Spring itself, Spring Framework itself. And so there's going to be a little bit of extra work and delay in staying up to date on those dependencies. And so we were able, and specifically Joe was able to get us upgraded to the latest and greatest. So we just did a Spring Security 5.7 release last week as well, or 2 weeks ago. And so this has been upgraded to that latest and greatest. So 5.7.1, I believe, is dependent on in-spring authorization server. So you can kind of come down and see that, in fact, we did that upgrade. And there were a number of specific things that happened with that. And they're kind of internal details to some degree in the project, but there were a number of users that were bumping into some issues with our Spring Security 5.5 dependency and trying to move up to Spring Security 5.6 and now 5.7. And it was just around how, some of the packaging was managed. And so there was a lot of moving parts and deprecations and cleanup that ultimately, if you move up to the 0.3.0 release, now you get the benefit of being on the latest and greatest. Everything's compatible and cleaned up. Deprecations have been removed. And so if you're, on the old stuff, it should be fairly easy to upgrade, but you can kind of find details in the release notes on what's changed there. But that's happened. And so that's a big deal because that gets us realigned with everything that's going on in the latest round of releases in the Spring ecosystem. And it really sets the stage for what's next. And so that's why I'm most excited about it, because you can imagine that what's next for us now that we've kind of gotten through this big release is, we could start looking at, what is happening in the larger Spring ecosystem with Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3 and, native and all of these other things that are going on. And this positions us well to begin the conversation of moving towards that and what does that look like. So that was a big point of this release as well. So hopefully for many users, not a lot has changed, though again, some deprecations were removed. If you're using some stuff that happened to be deprecated, you'll want to click in on the remove deprecations here, number 732, and find out about what's changed. But for most of you, it will be fairly standard, and you won't have to do much work to move up to 0.3.0. And from there, a lot of the other stuff in the breaking changes section is similar. There's just a lot of just very high level improvements that have happened. And I would say maybe the only other one that might be of significant relevance to folks is this plain code challenge method that was removed. And so again, probably won't be able to do it justice explaining what Pixie is and what code challenge methods are. But for those of you who may have been using Pixie already, you're going to, and that's PKCE, if you're wondering why I say Pixie, proof key for code exchange. That if you're using that already and you're wondering, what's going on with the plain being removed, you can click in on this and find out a little bit about that. But that was removed. And so the only code challenge method that remains is the hashed variant, the SHA-256 variant that is the most secure.
I believe I saw a video where Joe Granja explained why that was being removed. And then I think this is also a good time to say, if you're using some of these things that have breaking changes, that's one of those values that we want to provide here in the Spring office hours. Bring your questions, right? We talked about the different resources that we have for the Spring security community, but bring those questions here. Let us know what you're running into, because again, Dan and I don't have all the answers, but we know guys like Steve, so we can get you the answers that you need. Bring your questions.
And I know guys like Joe, so if yeah.
Excellent.
Cool. So just wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything else I wanted to touch on here, and I don't think so. Again, I kind of mentioned, I'll just clarify a little bit about what I meant with repackaging and some of the things that were going on there. The JWT encoder is a class that, again, for those who are more familiar, some of this may shoot past a few folks that haven't learned much about either Spring Security or Spring Authorization Server yet, but the JWT encoder is a class that was introduced in, I believe, Spring Security 5.6. And obviously now it's available in 5.7 as well. And that originated, some of that actually even started before I joined the team, so I don't probably have the full background, but that originated in Spring Authorization Server as a need to encode a JWT. And so you're taking information in headers and in claims in the body of a JWT, JSON Web Token, and you're encoding that into this string, this token string. And so that originated in Spring Authorization Server. There was a PR that was happening on the Spring security side to kind of make that generally available as something you can get with Spring Security's OAuth support in the core. And so once that PR was merged in Spring Security, there was kind of a conflict between that and the version of that class that lived in the Spring Authorization Server code base. And so this issue here, again, Joe did a lot of this work to kind of reconcile that and clean that up. And so if you happen to be directly using, and it's pretty unlikely, but you may have been directly using JWT encoder in Spring Authorization Server, there's going to be some changes in how that works. And there's a method that its signature would have changed if you're going from the deprecated version in Spring Authorization Server to the fully supported version that's actually in the core of Spring Security's OAuth support. So that's one also worth looking into for folks. Yeah, so that's it for breaking changes. And if we kind of glance through the list of new features, we really kept it light on new features. And so I'm actually really happy to see such a long list of things, considering how light we kept it on the feature list. But a lot of these things are very focused on the reference documentation. And so that was a big part of this release, as we've talked about already. You can see a number of the different sections we added here. Let's see, support for ASCII Doctor. That's again very internal, but because we're building a multi-page site for our documentation here, that was part of that work. And that brings me to the next topic, which may be more relevant for our contributors out there. We've upgraded to Gradle 7. So if you're going to actually clone the source code for Spring Authorization Server and contribute, we've upgraded to Gradle 7, and this aligns us with the larger Spring ecosystem as well. Spring Security, for example, had upgraded to Gradle 7 not too long ago. And there was a lot of work done here to upgrade to Gradle 7 for various reasons. But we have our own build now that supports Gradle 7. There's a lot of work that was put into this. Personally, I worked on this one, and it was a lot of fun learning and going deep into Gradle. But the main outcome of that is for contributors that you're going to be using Gradle 7 if you build the project. And the last one that I'll touch on here, we just had a conversation about this, so more to come on it, but we did include an upgrade to Java 11 in this release, and we'll see how that goes. I think we've had a number of comments already from folks that are like, hey, we're using Java 8, why are we using Java 11? And so again, we'll revisit that one, but the idea was that we're going to start moving towards that Java 17 target. And so that was kind of at least one of the reasons why this one got into the release. And the other one was mainly because with the upgrade to Gradle 7, there was just dependencies that we're using Java 11 for the build specifically. And so, yeah.
I dream of a world where everyone is off of Java 8.
Yes. Yes.
It's an exciting place. So many performance upgrades, so many new features, but everybody is still kind of. Do you find that it's mostly large enterprises? It's not somebody sitting at a desk as a solo developer going, I need Java 8, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. It's hard to know specifically. Most of the folks that give us comments won't give their story personally, but you can kind of see that trend definitely playing out.
One of these days.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying one of these days.
Yeah.
We'll get there.
We will. Yeah, but one of the comments that was made that was a good point, and I just kind of read and responded to this one this morning, was that, hey, the rest of the Spring ecosystem still, for the non-Spring Boot 3, non-Spring Framework 6, stuff that's going on in the main branch of each project. It still actually supports Java 8. And so that was a good point. So again, more to come on that. We may revisit that one. So, yeah.
Yeah, and a reminder, Spring Boot 3, Spring Framework 6, they are rebasing to Java 17. That's why you brought up the move towards Java 17. In order to keep up with all the amazing things that are happening in the Java community and building these modern applications with modern tools, it was time to move the needle a little bit and move that base Java version to Java 17. So that's happening. Those are both coming later this year, and I'm sure that the Spring Authorization Server has plans to be on that same time frame for changing its support model. So now that we're talking about Spring Boot 3 and Spring Framework 6 that are coming, I heard from a little bird that you've done some experiments with the Spring Authorization Server and making them native using GraalVM for those really tiny footprints. Can you tell us anything about that, or is that just a rumor?
I can give you a little, and again, there's going to be so much more work to do. So I won't say anything that hasn't happened yet. But hopefully you get a sense from kind of what I've been talking through. We're getting up to Spring Security 5.7 with this release, and so that definitely lays a foundation for moving to that next milestone, that next step. And I think that is why this release is important as a stepping stone, if for no other reason, and there are plenty of other reasons. But so certainly we're looking towards that Spring Framework 6 baseline and Java 17 and all of that. That has not happened yet, and so we've just kind of started some of the next pieces that will be kind of intermingled with building out a plan for the next major release, as we'll call it, of Spring Authorization Server. So the work that I've done on Spring Native, or not on Spring Native, but related to Spring Native and related to Spring Boot integrations, were more on the Spring Boot 2.7 side of things. So they're not necessarily yet compatible with or thinking forward towards the Boot 3 and Framework 6 stuff. But I was playing around with getting a native executable of Spring Authorization Server running, and it's still using the experimental Spring Native support. So I won't say too much more about that, other than that running it natively is amazing. And so I look forward to when we get that next piece laid of what we're talking about and going up to Spring Framework 6 and actually getting it running as part of just being on Spring Framework 6. I'm looking forward to that. But the other part of that was exciting was just looking at kind of improving that getting started experience for Spring Authorization Server. And so that, whether it relates to native or not, was exciting just to see, because I've been using this like many people in the community who are already using Spring Authorization Server. If I kind of go back to that getting started on the documentation, there's a few things that you have to do, and it's not bad, but obviously we've become so used to going to start.spring.io and just getting started with like 0 lines of code, or maybe 0 lines of code and some properties or YAML configuration, and to have to write all of this code for some folks is like, wow, that's a lot. It's not, by the way, but it kind of feels like it. And so I'm excited about what it would look like to reduce this to pretty much 0 lines of code and maybe some properties. And so that's kind of what I've been working on. I do have a branch that I shared, I think, on Twitter, if you're interested in that. And it kind of takes all of the configuration here, where you have this registered client repository with a bunch of Java code. You're setting up the client ID, the client secret, the methods, the grant types, the redirect URIs and scopes, and maybe even some specific settings in your deployment, and taking this and just making it YAML configuration. And then from there, now that you have 0 lines of code and a little bit of properties, compiling it natively and seeing that you can actually run this native authorization server without, any code, and it's cool. So that's me. That's what I'm excited about. But that's kind of where we're at, and that's still ongoing. So more to come.
Very cool. Well, I'm going to bring everybody in here, and yeah, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that this was valuable time. I think this is a format. I learned a lot today. I appreciate everything that you shared. And yeah, first guest.
Thank you for having me.
I think it went well. So
I think it went really well.
Yeah. Typically, we like to, give some time for Q&A at the end. Again, and following that office hours format. If there's questions, feel free to ask them. It doesn't have to be on Spring Security or Spring Authorization Server. That's what office hours is for. And if not, it's been wonderful. This has been a great session. I'm looking forward to more.
Yeah, I do have a quick question just while we see if any questions come in. So Authorization Server kind of lives on Spring Security. I haven't been following Spring Security lately just because I've been in so many other projects, but can you talk about Spring Framework as it pertains, or Spring Security as it pertains to like Spring Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3.0? What does that story look like, or is that going to happen after those releases kind of come out?
No, that's a good question. So as a whole, I would say the Spring ecosystem is very tightly aligned on that target of Java 17 and obviously Spring Framework 6 as kind of the foundation of that. And so Spring Security, if you kind of browse to the main repository of Spring Security itself, it's fully on that baseline. So we're actually consuming, as part of our continuous integration, snapshot builds of Spring Framework 6, and it's all good. I think things are largely working there as far as I'm aware, and obviously there's community members are trying it out. I hope they continue to and give us feedback and issues on things that aren't working. But it's happening for sure.
Cool.
And so, yeah, the Spring Authorization Server side of it is going to lag just a small bit behind that. But I think that, because our release cycle is off phase a little bit, we're doing a different release cycle every 2 months instead of every 6.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives us an opportunity to actually, delay that upgrade a little bit. We were working through some of these features, now the reference documentation, and then from there, it's going to be, who knows? It could be real exciting next 6 months. So I think it's definitely happening.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be some exciting times at the end of the year, just in the Spring ecosystem. So I'm looking forward to all of that.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I don't see any questions in the chat.
Yep.
This has been great. It's good to see everybody. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, guys. Pleasure.
Take care. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.